Well, we're here in December. We've made it through 12 months talking about George Washington. We've talked about George Washington and the Bhagavad Gita. I bet you never thought you would have that conversation. And we have talked about all the different lessons we can learn from George Washington. So tonight is the night where we're going to kind of kick back, enjoy the holidays, and we're actually going to get to hear this stuff. Instead of hear it from me, we're going to hear it from the horse's mouth. So we're going to hear from General Washington. Just so you understand, the time frame of when we're talking is really right at the end of the Constitution. So George Washington will be able to talk to you about his time in the Revolutionary War and in his involvement in the Constitutional Convention, but he doesn't know yet what happens to him as president, so don't tell him. Because then you destroy the time frame and everything's different. So we're not going to bring that up to him. But anyway, before we get to George Washington, though, we're going to have the opportunity to talk to James Madison. Now, James Madison is going to talk to us briefly because, as you all know from having taken these, those of you who have been here, James Madison was very involved in seeing to it that George Washington had his role in the Constitutional Convention that he had. So I'm going to talk to James Madison a little bit about that. If you're all interested in James Madison as I am, what we're going to do is I'm going to ask a few questions to people, then I'm going to open it up, and I certainly encourage you to ask as many questions as you would like. And then we're going to go back there and we're going to have wine and cheese, and you're going to be able to talk to Mr. Madison and General Washington. So let me begin by just introducing you all to James Madison. Let me go again. Here we go. Mr. Madison.
How do you do, Mr. Cross? How do you do, everyone? Oh, good to see you all. What a wonderful setting.
Well, Mr. Madison, thank you so much for coming. We have been talking here for the past year or so a lot about a man that you know very well, General George Washington. And I wanted to talk to you about your involvement in bringing him here to Philadelphia to participate in the Constitutional Convention. Now, first of all, tell them a little bit about the Annapolis Convention and the difficulties of getting the Constitutional Convention going.
Oh, well, I'd be happy to. I am not known for my oratory, so can everyone hear me all right? How about in the back? It's often people say to me, Mr. Madison, could you please speak up? We can't hear you past the first row. Well, the difficulty with the Constitution, it was really with the Articles of Confederation first. And in the interim years between the peace, after we had secured that and gotten a treaty from Paris, the years 1784, 85, 86 were about developing the country now that we were standing on the world stage by ourselves. And the kind of things we were thinking about were economic in nature. And so we were developing ideas about transportation, canal systems. The Potomac Company was started, the James River Company was started, and then we were also thinking about the poor way that the Articles of Confederation would service the country as a whole. And we decided, there was a convention in Mount Vernon that Mr. Washington, His Excellency, hosted, but unfortunately Governor Henry did not get the word out to the rest of us that there was one there, otherwise I certainly would have attended. And what transpired from that was a convention, as Mr. Cross says, in Annapolis, Maryland, where we had called as many delegates that could possibly come to talk about the economic situation and its development, paying back our war debts, etc. But the problem was that only 12 delegates total showed up. And there were only 5 states that were represented. And it is rather ironic, don't you think, that the host state, Maryland, didn't send any of those any delegates of their own. So there was not enough for quorum, that was not enough to make any formal business taken care of, and that was the second time that I met Mr. Alexander Hamilton. Now, we had been in the Continental Congress together in an overlap year in 1782, and so we were familiar with each other, but we both came away from that convention thinking the exact same thing. Number one, that we needed to call a second convention in Philadelphia, and a call was to be made out for all 13 of the states to send delegates, because we realized that if we could only get 12 people to Annapolis, Maryland, other people weren't really aware, concerned enough, or worse, completely apathetic about the idea of surviving under the Articles of Confederation. There was an assumption to be made that they would automatically work. Well, Mr. Hamilton and I thought very clearly at the time that no, they would not work. They were too weak. They did not serve the revolution, the cause well at all, having no way to develop any war chest for the monies required to run an entire army. So we decided to try and prod the general out of retirement, which turned out to be a rather difficult thing to persuade him to do. So I did make a visit to Mount Vernon, and I told the general, I said that it was the opinion of every judicious friend whom I consulted that your name could not be spared from a deputation that came to Philadelphia to talk about strengthening the Articles of Confederation. The other hurdle that we had was Congress's reluctance, I would say, to do much of anything about a simple revision, if anything at all, to the Articles of Confederation. And Mr. Hamilton and I were very firm in our notion that they needed to be completely done away with and start over with a much stronger nationalistic form to bring the United States together, because don't forget, we were 13 sovereign countries. And in order to get a country formed out of that and not internally break up by ourselves, let alone the possibility of usurpation from a country at large, that we needed to implore the rest of the colonies to attend this convention in Philadelphia. So between Mr. Hamilton, Mr. Knox, Mr. Randolph, and others, I wrote everyone to try and get them to communicate with the general and say that if you did not personally come, sir, no one else would pay attention. Look what happened in Annapolis, Maryland. We needed to rather be very overt in our ideas about getting people to the convention. So in person, I took a trip there, and I said to His Excellency what I mentioned before, that he needed to come out of retirement, which he was very reluctant to do. He had officially retired with the Treaty of Paris, saying that he would never hold public office again. And being a man of not only great charisma and great leadership, but a man of great character, was very loath to break a promise. And besides that, there was another lesser reason that I don't know if the general would like to share or not, but there was a meeting of the Society of the Cincinnati, which he was involved in, and he was sick and ill, and what it was actually was a problem with his shoulder, I do believe. But he did not want to come to Philadelphia to overtly support an organization that had a hereditary requirement to the Society of Cincinnati. It's a military organization. All the officers started it. It was a part of the fact that they all suffered. They all met Washington in Fraunces Tavern in New York City and had that tearful goodbye, which no one could forget. And yet, the general's presence was necessary in order for the rest of the population, general having almost universal appeal. There were moments where his abilities were doubted, but they were overcome to great benefit to the country, in my opinion. So the Annapolis Convention led to a call for delegates from all 13 of the states to attend a universal collection of delegates, such that we could not just revise the Articles of the Confederation, but at least satisfy the exigencies of the Union. And so therefore, that was my way of saying so, because the Congress's caveat was that we could modify them, but they specifically said don't do anything drastic. Well, in discussions with the general and all the other Virginia delegates, we decided that since I had come to Philadelphia not only having studied all ancient and modern confederacies, thanks to my good friend Jefferson, who sent me 200 books from France on ancient and modern confederacies, and I wrote a paper very creatively called Ancient and Modern Confederacies. And then I decided that, well, that wasn't enough because we had to find a solution. The conclusion was that none of them worked. The only kind of government system that the world knows is the divine right of kings. And every other system has failed, even if they've lasted as long as Rome. So we had quite a job ahead of us, and although 70 delegates were invited to the convention, 55 chose to show up at various time periods. Some came, some left and returned, some came, left, and never came back. And during the convention, there was about a dozen of us or so that I think actually spoke on a regular basis. And Washington presided over the whole thing, and I suppose that would be part of the conversation you want to have with His Excellency himself.
Absolutely. Mr. Madison is very rightly known as the father of the Constitution.
Oh, I don't think so, sir.
I'm telling you, that's the way it's going to go.
Oh, we have another soothsayer in the House.
And there's really three reasons. One is his getting General Washington to be a part of it. That was very important. The second thing he did was he was very involved in the debate. He made the second most speeches of anybody in the convention. But the third thing that I really appreciate your doing was the incredible notes you took of the Constitutional Convention. Mr. Madison, and I'm guessing it's from all the books that you read and all of the studying you did, realized how important it would be for future generations to be able to see everything that happened there. And so beyond everything else he was doing, which was trying to convince people that what was clearly starting a whole new constitution was really just a revision of the Articles of Confederation, which nobody believed, so he gave up on that on day one. But the other thing he did was he wrote down every single thing that happened throughout the entire time. And that is one of the greatest services to this country that have ever been performed. So, sir, I want to thank you for all of your service to the country.
Well, thank you very much. It's my privilege and pleasure. It's always at the forefront of my mind to do what is best for our republic.
Thank you, sir. And now if you can come get us the general to come out.
Oh, I certainly will. Good to see you all tonight.
And feel free, he is going to be here tonight, so if you have any other questions about the Constitution or about his very interesting life, he will be there to discuss it with you. And so now we are ready for the man we've been talking about all year, General Washington. Thank you so much for coming today.
May I preface my remarks this evening by being expressive, permit me, to be expressive of profoundest gratitude for inviting me into your presence this evening. Mrs. Washington pleads indisposition this evening, and she is so very sorry she is not able to be with us, but she sends her absolute and very best to you all. I must say as well that seldom, if ever, does one really have the opportunity to come face to face with his posterity. So it is, again, with words that are inadequate to describe. I come into your presence this evening humbly and thankfully, and Mr. Cross, thank you for proffering the invitation to attend.
Thank you for coming, Jen.
My great and good pleasure.
We have been discussing you and your life for the past year. And
oh my goodness. Oh my goodness.
We know everything we can about you. I'm sure you've hidden some things, but what we could look up, we did. And one of the things we've talked a lot about is your childhood, the manner that you grew up, and where you started and where you went in a very brief period of time. So if you could talk a little bit about, of course, we all know that your father died when you were quite young, what effect that had on you, and how you were still able given the constraints of the time you grew up in, how you were still able to become the individual that you became.
Oh, yes. April of 1743, my father passed away rather suddenly. And so at the age of 11, I found myself as perhaps what you would describe as being the man of the house, being the oldest of my siblings of my father's second marriage, Mary Ball Washington. My life with respect to the education, early life, is something I did not discuss really at great length during the course of my lifetime. I referred to my education, such as it was, as being, quote, defective. I was not university trained. I did not attend college, did not matriculate. I did, of course, up until about age 15, tutors. Mr. Hobby comes to mind, but others indifferent with respect to teachers. So you will not see in any of my correspondence, any of my letters, anything about the tutors I had growing up. But you will hear about one. These are the individuals who had quite the influence a most positive influence on me. And of course, my older half-brother, Lawrence, he had a great hand in raising me. He was as a surrogate father. The members of the Fairfax family, particularly William Fairfax and Thomas, 6th Lord Fairfax, had a great influence on me as well. But I think, Mr. Cross, many people should also understand and realize that an education is not something just in the moment and for the moment. It is something that, as long as one lives, education, as far as becoming educated, if you have the ability, say, for example, to read, if there is a degree of literacy, and you have access to books, or you have access to others. Where am I going with this? I sat in the House of Burgesses beginning in 1758. And I, of course, had the reputation as one who was a bit taciturn and reserved. I'm doing more talking here than I ever did in a single day in the House of Burgesses. Seldom, if ever, did I speak for 3 to 5 minutes altogether. But the importance of listening and imbibing, learning from others, to understand what one does not know, and to know that one does not know at all. That began at an early age, what you would call or refer to as my teenage years, into my 20s. But life was my school. I, at an early age, perhaps you've heard, was charged with the task of warning the French out of the Ohio country. Governor Dinwiddie did send me as a youth of only 20, at the time, 1753, 21 years of age, and charged with the task of carrying a warning to the French commandant to warn the French out of the Ohio country. Virginia claimed the Ohio country. You're familiar with it. Here we are in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, yes? And so, southwestern Pennsylvania to near Lake Erie, I did go. A trek from Williamsburg, Virginia, beginning on 31st of October, 1753, and ending on the 16th of January, 1754, into the wilderness. Perhaps no one of my generation, those whom you call or refer to as the founders, as I understand it, had more in the way of experience on the frontier than I did. The frontier was one of my schools. So House of Burgesses, the frontier, my half-brother Lawrence, and if I ever make reference to my half-brother again, it will from thenceforward, my brother. I referred to him as my brother, even though we shared different mothers, same father, a brother to me. And of course, it was Lawrence who named the home that I did occupy for 40-plus years of my life, Mount Vernon. My older half-brother Lawrence served under Admiral Edward Vernon in the Caribbean, and he admired that gentleman so much that upon his return to Virginia, he named the home, which had been known as Little Hunting Creek Plantation, he named it Mount Vernon in honor of that man whom he admired so very much. And of course, I would retain the name once I did inherit Mount Vernon. With respect and regard to other schools, served in the First and Second Continental Congresses. And of course, you heard Mr. Madison, my able coadjutor, talking about, mentioning the convention, what we called or referred to as the Grand Convention. I understand you all refer to it as the Constitutional Convention. We called it the Grand Convention. And I learned quite a bit there. How many of you would like to have educators, teachers, such as Mr. Madison, Dr. Franklin, James Wilson? Now, Thomas Jefferson and John Adams were not present at the convention, but I learned much from those gentlemen as well. Patrick Henry, the others. So, with respect to my education, it was very broad, nothing formal. I never visited the land of my ancestry, so some people think I was born in England. Didn't set foot in England. Was not born there, never set foot in England, born in the county of Westmoreland, approximately 10 a.m., 22nd of February, 1732. So 70 miles downriver from Mount Vernon. But of course, then there's the old style. Some would celebrate my birthday, my natal day, my birthday, as February 11th. So the old style with respect to the older calendar, but then there was the switch, and so February 22nd, 1732. So born, they said, I was born with fine wisps of red hair on my head. And I was quite beefy, said one, as a young baby. But growing up, it's difficult, it was hard. There's no mincing words, I wasn't born to the aristocracy, I wasn't born to the upper class. Yeoman farmer, middling, gentry in the colony of Virginia. And so I did have some work to do. And so some might call or refer to me as one who climbed, and that I did. Ambition, early in life, to distinguish myself, to rise above the common run of men. That I determined to do from an early age. And let us not forget, one of my great teachers was honored Madam, my mother, the other Mrs. Washington, Mary Ball Washington. You've perhaps heard some things about her, that we did not get along, that perhaps I had some mother issues. We were so very much alike in so many respects. And as it is, as you perhaps know, those who are very much alike sometimes repel. Like charges, yes? Like charges repel. But let us not forget my mother with respect and in regard to my upbringing and my education. So I hope I have not been too long-winded. I know my reputation for taciturnity and reserve, I'm dispensing with it this evening.
So your first real experience in war was in the 7 Years' War.
Yes.
And it didn't end in a very satisfactory way for you, your involvement with the armed forces. If you could possibly address that.
Yes, I would be more than happy to, though there is some pain in conveying some of that which I experienced during that period of my life. I, in fact, as perhaps some of you know, was held to be responsible for beginning what became known as the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War here in the colonies. Horace Walpole said of me, quote, "The shot fired by a young Virginian in the backwoods of America set the world on fire." That was me. Jumonville Glen, May 1754. Oh, I was ambitious and impetuous, intemperate, desirous of making a name for myself, and doing so sooner rather than later. So late May 1754, the western wilds of Pennsylvania, found that there were approximately 30 Frenchmen, and they were encamped at the base of some rocks in the forest. Tennekerison, the half-king, he and his warriors led my men, led me to their location. And it was all over within 15 minutes, a quarter of an hour. I gave the order to open fire on those in the encampment, that which became known as Jumonville Glen. The Sieur de Jumonville was, according to the French, according to members of his party, they were on a mission similar to what mine had been. Remember, I was sent by Dinwiddie to warn the French out of the Ohio country? Well, they, ostensibly, were on a mission to warn my men, me, out of the Ohio country. Did I believe them? No. To this day, do I? No, I do not. And I'm pushing 291 years of age. It was something that, I'm going to choose my words quite carefully, as I was wont to do, and advisedly. It got out of my control relatively quickly. Is anyone familiar with the story, what became of Sieur de Jumonville, who was essentially a diplomat, if the French were to be believed? I spoke no French. As a matter of fact, Mr. Cross, I never learned a foreign language. Little French, thanks to the Marquis de Lafayette and Mr. Hamilton, but no fluency in any other language. Jumonville was trying to tell me something. Apparently what he was trying to convey was that he was on a peaceful mission to warn me out of the Ohio country. It's claimed on behalf of the French, so the English should leave. Before he could finish his thoughts, the half-king would strike a blow at Jumonville. And because of company here tonight, polite company, suffice it to say that it was a wound to the head delivered by hatchet. And I was standing but a few feet away when the blow was struck. Did I intend for that to happen? No. And it did come across, it did serve as a signal. As soon as that was done to Jumonville, other Indian warriors set upon the French who were attempting to surrender. Out of my control. I was 22 years of age. The shot fired in the backwoods of America by a young Virginian set the world on fire. The shot fired, shots plural, but that first shot I ordered, because there's always a mystery, no mystery to me. I gave the order to fire. The shot fired by a young Virginian in the backwoods of America. You are looking at an older man here, but that young Virginian was the one whom you're looking at this evening. Again, 22 years of age. Oh, I wanted to be famous. Famous is part of infamous, is it not? Oh, infamous I was. And I did believe, Mr. Cross, that it was, for the most part, over for me. Particularly with the events of the following year at Fort Necessity. Or later on, and then into the next year with Braddock's defeat. Before Braddock's defeat, July 9, 1755. But Fort Necessity, so I stay in the area, 1754. I am responsible, the French consider me to be responsible for killing a diplomat, for killing an emissary, for being an assassin. Well, the Sieur de Jumonville had a brother, and his brother leads the attack on Fort Necessity, I built this small stockade. You're perhaps familiar with it. Perhaps some of you have visited the site. And we were beaten, essentially. But then a storm, a thunderstorm. There are very few thunderstorms I can recall that were as bad as the one on that July evening and into the night, July 1754. So as May, Jumonville is killed. You have June, July, and the French and a large American Indian force is headed toward Fort Necessity, a little stockade in a meadow, not the best situated. Lessons learned, Mr. Cross. But I'll tell you, up to 1799, the year of my demise, I never, ever spoke in such a way as to indicate that I had a change of mind about the site for Fort Necessity. Dug in my heels, you know, that it was a good site on which to wage a battle. You know perhaps better than I. But we were in process of being defeated. And then the rains came. Providential. Out of the darkness comes a French voice, the accent I'll never forget. Voulez-vous parler? Voulez-vous parler? Do you want to talk? And they had an offer. Oh, we'll let you walk out. We will let you carry your arms, any supplies. We will keep our Indian allies at bay to the best of our ability. If you will but just leave this country and go back to Virginia. And as well, they wanted some of those prisoners back, the ones we took at Jumonville Glen. And so we effected an agreement. I signed Jacob von Braun from Fredericksburg, Virginia. He was the translator for us, and he also had taught me fencing. He had been a teacher of mine, Mr. Cross, fencing. He translated. It's dark. Spluttering candlelight. Pages begin to become a little rain-soaked. And he tells me it's a good agreement. Little did I know, and much to my surprise, in its wake, the French regarded it as a confession. I confessed to the assassination of Jumonville. They put that in there, assassinat. And Jacob von Braun, Mr. von Braun, translated it as killed. Oh, he did tell me, he said, you're also saying that during the melee, Jumonville was killed as a result of your actions, your orders, your actions. Yes, he was. But the wording, the French believed that they had effected a coup, and they had a confession that I had assassinated Jumonville. And so I became quite infamous in the courts of Europe, but not in my home colony, not in Virginia, regarded as something of a hero. In particular, because one of the French prisoners that was taken at Jumonville Glen was one who was wanted by colonial and English authorities as fomenting Indians on the frontier against English settlers, against English colonists, and was considered to have quite the volume of blood on his hands. He was in custody in Williamsburg. I did not want him given back to the French. But in the courts of Europe, I was excoriated and vilified. And when I heard months later about all that had been said about me in the courts of Europe, I had made the mistake, I will say this, but never took it back. My favorite brother, John Augustine Washington, Jack. After Lawrence, of course, Lawrence. Okay. But when it came to full brother, full siblings, John Augustine Washington, Jack. I wrote a letter to him, and in it I stated, believe me, I've heard the bullets whistle, and there is something charming in the sound. How does that sound to you? I heard the bullets whistle, I reported to my brother, and believe me, there was something charming in the sound. Does that sound a bit crazy? Yes. Oh, and then King George II heard about it because the French published it, because in the wake of Fort Necessity, part of my baggage had been captured, taken, and one of my journals and some letters, copies. So King George II at the time, not the third, King George II said he wouldn't say so if he had been used to hearing many. Remember, I was only 22 years of age. And so young, impetuous, eager to make a mark, impatient. You know what they said about me as well, Mr. Cross? They said, he was trying to take all the glory for himself before reinforcements arrived into the Ohio country to lend aid and assistance to him. There may be something, I own, there may be more than a little something to that. 22 years of age. And then the next year, age 23, Braddock's campaign. I'd resigned from the Virginia Regiment. They wanted to change everything. They wanted to create new companies, reorganize. I resigned. At age 22, 1754, I was going to retire. But then, the 44th and 48th Regiments of Foot, from garrison duty in Ireland to the New World they did come, in order to be part of a campaign to take the forks of the Ohio away from the French. The French had built that fort, Duquesne. And Braddock's base of operations was in Alexandria, Virginia, 9 miles from Mount Vernon. And so I became a member of his military family. I served without rank, and I would only answer to Major General Edward Braddock. I did not want to answer to anyone else. Only to him. He accepted the terms, and he thought that my knowledge of the frontier and warfare, in particular, respect to the Indians and the French, would be something he could use, would be something of value. July 9, 1755, and the days following, I shall never forget. I become emotional as I think about the cries and the lamentations as we retreated. Braddock, of course, received a mortal wound through both lungs. He was shot in the side. But he survived for at least 3 days, 72 hours. And we evacuated him. One of the worst losses in the military history of England, Great Britain. 75%, 3/4 of the officer corps cut down. And I look around, 5 hours of battle. I take a look around. I'm the one in charge. I'm 23. I was an aide to General Braddock. 5 hours I shall never forget. I had 2 horses shot from under me, 4 bullet holes through my clothing, a cover shot from my head, and emerged unscathed. the retreat effected in pitch black, trying to remove ourselves from the area of engagement. At times, those who were assisting me, they had to crawl in order to find the demarcation of the trail with respect to the trees, shrubs. It was that dark, with men crying out, the dying, the wounded. The person must have a heart of adamant who is not affected by that. And I was unable to help most. That led the retreat back into Maryland. 23 years of age. And then eventually with a Forbes expedition, learning how to conduct a campaign properly, eventually Duquesne was taken. And when it was taken, in the wake of that, I tendered my resignation as colonel of the Virginia Regiment and retired back to Mount Vernon. But of course, did get married in January of 1759, 12th night, the 12th day of Christmas, the Epiphany, New Kent County, Virginia. One of the best decisions, in education, Mr. Cross, one of the best decisions that I ever did make, marrying Lady Washington. She was my amiable lifelong companion, my coadjutor as well, what you might call or refer to as a sounding board. And yes, she was wealthy. Does it or does it not today, marriage, have an economic component? But she was absolutely, just with respect to managing a household, managing the plantations, and quite perspicacious with respect to things political. She could read people. People adored my wife. She was one of those who made everyone feel welcome. Talk about a social skill set. Mrs. Washington had it undoubtedly, completely. And so when people ask about Lady Washington, Mrs. Washington, she deserves quite the credit for my advancement, if you think about it. What did John Adams say later on? And I'm going to go ahead of where we're at. What would General Washington have been if he had not married the widow Custis? Good question. Pleased we'll never really know. Because we did marry, and it was 40 years, almost 41, of, for the most part, bliss and challenges, of course. But marriage is the most interesting event of one's life, as I said to the younger members of the family. Mr. Cross, I feel I've gone on at great length. I feel as if I'm among friends here, and so it wasn't unusual for me in my time to go on at length in the company of close friends and family. And also demonstrate some humor, yes? Mr. Cross, have I taken up too much time?
Not at all. And I could talk to you all night, but I'm going to ask you just one more question because I know everybody here is going to want to ask you some questions. John Adams is going to nominate you to be the General of the Army in 1775. Now, there really isn't an army, so to speak. There really isn't a federal government behind you. And you're going to ride out to the Boston area. And people come out and see you, and we're filled with so much hope. Now, I'm wondering how you were feeling, because your experience in the military was far less than the people who were going to be opposing you from England. You had all of these difficulties in terms of how Congress didn't have very much power, that at that point you only had a small civilian group of people out in the Massachusetts area, and yet you seem to be going with full confidence, and your letters seem to indicate full confidence. I'm curious as to what you were feeling at that time, knowing the burden that you had and knowing how difficult the road ahead was going to be.
I opened up to Lady Washington. I opened up through correspondence to that favored brother, John Augustine Washington, remember, to whom I wrote, "I've heard the bullets whistle, and believe me, there is something charming in the sound." I would write to him. And I was expressive of certain feelings being experienced in the wake of having been so nominated. I advertised my availability to my fellow members of Congress. You perhaps have heard that I did wear my uniform to the sessions. That was essentially an advertisement, my availability for service, willing to serve if chosen, and even if not. Some have wondered what I would have done had it been some other. I would have served the cause. It's for the cause. But there are those doubts. But one thing we mustn't do, particularly those who would be a leader, you must keep that doubt at bay, because it can be oh so destructive. That self-doubt in particular. Do you know what I'm saying? Yes? And so despite the glorious burden, going to press forward, going to go on. Concerns and worries about Lady Washington, I found most oppressive. And quite frankly, a bit depressing. What is going to become of my wife, her situation? I told her, friends, family members, stay with them. Mount Vernon is essentially marked. Oh, His Majesty's troops knew where my home was. And if they didn't, they soon would. Not difficult to find. To stay in our in-town home in Alexandria. So there are concerns and worries first and foremost about my wife and her situation. And then, of course, other family members. What will become of them? And then tertiary concerns, considerations for my home and properties. When it comes to our fortunes, by 1783, I had lost over 70% of my net worth for having been away, for the sake of having been away. Inconsequential in the final analysis. But others lost everything. All was on the line. And prior to the Delaware crossing, victory or death. What were we fighting for? Principles, ideas, to make them real. Yes? Have they been made real in your time? Oh, some expressive of a little doubt there, sir. You are denizens of the 21st century. I'm from a much different time, but you know what I'd like to think, Mr. Cross? It comes to that period through which I lived, the Enlightenment. We didn't solve all problems or think we could within the short space of our adult lifetimes, yes? But what we hoped to do, among other things, was to put in place a system by and through which those principles, those ideas could be realized and would be realized. With respect to the issue of slavery, enslavement, please take my word for it, because you can, that there was the belief, quite sincere, I can assure you, that at some time in the not-so-distant future, we had confidence that 2-3 generations from our time, slavery would be abolished. That what we set in motion, and this is one of those things toward the end of my life, trying to get clear, to quit a species of property that I found so repugnant. Didn't express it publicly, but I said privately that I found slavery, enslavement, repugnant. Why, General Washington, did you continue to own human beings? Grim necessity, but no excuses. That's a cold explanation. And hoping that we had emplaced a system that at some point in the not so very distant future, the people would abolish that institution. I was hoping as well when it came to science, what you call science, we called natural philosophy, advances in natural philosophy, and technology, invention, would rid the world of the institution, particularly the United States. Someone once asked, and this was Edmund Randolph. Edmund Randolph, who at the time of the Constitutional Convention, as you call it, the Grand Convention, he led the Virginia delegation in one sense because he was an office holder. He was the governor of the Commonwealth of Virginia at the time. He had heard me say, and he related it to Mr. Jefferson. And it's true, I did say it. If there were ever any conflict between the states of the North, of the northern parts of the country, and the states of the southern part of the country, that I, George Washington, would pack my bags, take leave of Mount Vernon, move to the north, and die of a broken heart. Posterity will never fully know or understand the sacrifices that were made by those of my generation. And that's not, again, that's not said with braggadocio, it's said with humility. I called it almost a miracle. How a band of men, sometimes, oftentimes reduced to wearing rags, leaving trails of blood in the snow for the lack of boots or shoes, wanting with respect to all the necessaries, those things needed by an army. It wasn't just one army I commanded over time. There was a revolving gate. Militia, continental forces, individuals leaving, enlistments up, recruiting, constant, inoculation for smallpox. And what had to be done when the troops were being inoculated? We didn't just fight as well for ourselves. We fought for posterity, as I said at Yorktown, as the British troops, His Majesty's troops and their Hessian auxiliaries were surrendering. As I recall this, emotion overwhelms me. Part of the orders, general orders for the day, from the Commander-in-Chief, General George Washington, to the combined Franco-American force. To summarize it, there is to be no gloating. We shall not make fun. There shall be no pejoratives cast the way of the surrendering British and Hessian troops. And Rochambeau made sure that the French contingent obeyed my orders. I was in overall command. Rochambeau made sure that everyone understood that distinctly. The behavior of my troops reflected on me, and we're not going to be poor winners. I said, they know they're defeated. Let us not mar the day and mar the memory of this day. 19th of October, 1781, in the town of York, Virginia. I let the troops know, and this is the quotation: there's to be no hurrahing, cheering, huzzaing of any type. You could have heard a pin drop in the path to surrender field. French troops arrayed one side, Continental Army troops on the other, and the surrendering British troops would walk between, and they would stack their arms. Oh, some threw them down, tried to break their weapons, in a fit acting like petulant children. My men said not a word. I said, when it comes to the line I want you all to remember, after telling them how to behave, the expectations for their behavior, said, posterity will huzzah for us. We contended for the fate of unborn millions. You. I am no longer active and around. I am no longer, in one sense, in your presence. But my hope would be that when it came to those ideas, those principles, freedom, justice, liberty, that over time they would be fully realized. It all begins during my lifetime. There weren't a great many people criticizing the institution of slavery in my lifetime. It had to start somewhere. And so it began in my time. And hopefully that is no longer an issue with all of you. Perhaps it does have legacies, but then that is your work. Think of something that is quite popular, that if you made a decision, or generally popular, or was believed to be of the utmost necessity, you try to take it away from Americans today. I invite you to think of the analogy or a metaphor, and then imagine how much success you would have in taking it away or getting rid of it. Is it the work of a day? Would it be the work of a week or a month or a year? I dare say it would not be, perhaps not even a lifetime. But liberty, freedom, they are quite contagious. And hopefully that contagion has carried itself into your time. You all have been so splendid with respect to your patience and forbearance. I am, again, sorry for going on at great length. If you have any interrogatives to proffer, I shall be more than happy to respond to them. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
So, do we have questions for the general? This is your chance. Yes, sir.
I'm very interested, Your Excellency, in your views of religion, the role it played both during the war and in the revision of the country as established in the Constitution of the nation.
With respect to the role of religion, with respect when it comes to the country, generally speaking, and its role, all the rest, I believed that as a moral support, religion was and is indispensably necessary with respect to how a free people, if a people is to be free, truly free. Remember in my circular letter to the states, to the governors of the 13 states in 1783, I discussed all of that we essentially have to be thankful for. What we have here, the opportunity comes to what I was saying about the Enlightenment, then when you look at the fruits, technological, philosophical, political, we have a book open before us with all of these answers, inviting us to go in a certain direction or way. Are you following? Yes? That researches of those, such as I said, philosophers, sages, we have the benefit of their thinking, their knowledge, practically and intellectually. We also have land, a land that is bountiful. We really want for nothing here. And you see that in the accounts going back to the initial age of discovery. Yes? What they report, what the early explorers reported with respect to what they found in the rivers. They found rivers teeming with fish, fowl, anything, again, no need, no cause, no reason for individuals to go hungry. Really no cause for a high level or degree of impoverishment. But if the American people failed to take advantage, failed to embrace all that I just have explicated, I said the fault will be entirely their own. Religion, an indispensable support. That's a quote from more than one letter, and of course, if I may, project forward the end of my chief magistracy, the end of my presidency, and what became known as the farewell address. Religion is one of those indispensable supports. What did Dr. Franklin say? He said, yes, you look at human beings with religion, but just imagine them without it. Profoundly humbling. Profoundly humbling. When you think or believe, have faith that there is something higher, and it is not just all about us. That it's not just the human, that it's not me. You would think, based on some accounts, and this is why I did not talk about the war for independence so very much. Whether it was family members, strangers sitting at table one year at Mount Vernon, 1,600, thinking about this number as far as over the years, the total, but just one year, but guests, 677 house guests in 1,798. Most of them I did not know. Many of them wanted to know about the American Revolution, the war for independence. I'm afraid most went away, disappointed, because I did not speak or talk at great length about my service in the war. But I will say this, it was not all about me. One man did not win it. Men, women, even children gave their lives in that conflict. It wasn't just a war for independence, there was also that Civil War aspect of and to it. And some people would say, oh, there's a civil war here in the colonies. No, there were 13 civil wars. The issues were as many and varied as the states in which they were being fought, from New Hampshire to Georgia. One did not know what one was getting into locally. All of the local jealousies, various types and kinds of issues, and people had opportunity to settle a score. That's what we were stepping into as the Army traveled. Yes, it was a civil war within the empire, but really 13. The number could be higher. But again, providence. How did, as has been said, how did 13 clocks chime as one Once again, providential. Remember, each one of the states considered itself as an independent country. Some states had their own navies. When Mr. Jefferson is at Philadelphia in June and July of 1776, and he's writing home and he's asking about what is happening in Virginia, he said, "Oh, how I wish I were back in my own country." Some might be confused by that. He's in the Commonwealth, he's in Pennsylvania, but his country was Virginia. And he means country. Once states started becoming such, colonies becoming states, they considered themselves independent countries, and it wasn't United, capital U, United States of America, it was lowercase u, United States of America. How to get all on the same page? And that was the question, whether it was prosecuting a war, dealing with the Articles of Confederation, launching a new nation under a constitution, that at Philadelphia, drafted at Philadelphia, 1787, and ratified by the necessary number of states. Church. How many know how difficult it is or challenging it is to begin a church or a club? And of course, people's feelings. Human nature has to be taken into consideration. Human nature. I was a student of human nature as well. To understand human beings and what actuates them. Oh, like romantic love, patriotism is a pretty little thing, but doesn't tend to be of long duration. I wish I could say that patriotism could be sustained and was sustained throughout the war for our independency. But no, there has to be something more. Some people might say, and they might consider themselves to be purists, oh, patriotism, because if people wanted things such as land bounties or money, oh, that sullies the cause, because the motivation is something other than patriotism. Men deserve to be paid. Men deserve the land bounties that they were promised. Interest is a large part of our nature. Also, the desire to be recognized, the desire to be known, the desire to be complimented, to have good things said about you. Let's not minimize any of that either. That's what I learned growing up. Just based on my own life experience and those of my friends and acquaintances and even strangers. Interest. Patriotism could carry maybe for a few months, but then that begins to wane. There has to be something more. It's a mix. Am I right or wrong? It's okay to say I'm wrong. You don't have to worry about General Washington. With respect to that humbling aspect of religion, that this isn't it, that we are not the be-all and end-all, that there is something more, that there is something higher. Humility and gratitude are two things that were big with me. You couldn't do anything close to anything worse than accusing me of being less than thankful, of ingratitude. I was always grateful for all that I received. And let it be known, I had been a vestryman, Pohick Church in Virginia, Christ Church, Falls Church. I had the responsibilities of a vestryman, and there were several. After the war, you might have heard that I did not take communion. That much is true. People should like to know why. I never said in my lifetime, but I'll leave you a thought, something to think about, leave you with something to, really to ruminate on. When you command men and you send individuals into combat, and you see them mortally wounded, killed outright, or wounded, survive, and are crippled for life. And not to mention the effect on one's mind. As I said, my memories of both the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War, and the War for Independence are quite vivid. And you don't ever get over that. Some people speculated, and they're onto something here, but pursue the thought. I felt I was not worthy to take communion. So those of you concerned, because I was Church of England and then after the break, Episcopal Church, USA. Mrs. Washington faithfully took communion. When she did, I walked to the back of the church and stood and waited for Lady Washington. Please don't go further in your thinking, believing that I had some issue with the deity, other than I just felt, after what I had been through, what I had seen, what I had experienced, maybe at some point, but up to 1799, I never did take communion. And again, based on experiences of wartime, not completely worthy or feeling so. But again, religion, morality, indispensably necessary as a support to a republican form of government. My great and good pleasure. I hope I haven't been too, how do you say, long-winded. You all have been the most gracious auditors. Yes, Mr. Cross.
So let us thank General Washington for coming. Both General Washington and Mr. Madison will be here for a little while, so if you have any questions, we're going to repair into the other room where there is some wine and cheese and other things. And let me wish everybody a very, very happy holiday this month. Thank you all for so much.
Thank you, David. Certainly.